Am I audible over there on the back? Okay, cool. So in this presentation, I'm going to explain the GENEA challenge, motivation, setup, and results. And as you can see on the slide, a lot of people put work into this challenge, and in particularly myself, Raymond, and Yungu put a huge amount of work here. So first of all, what do we mean by gesture generation? Broadly speaking, gesture generation is a task where, given some sort of control, we want to generate sequence of gestures. The control would often be audio or text, but it could equally be a pose, for example, pose of interlocutor, or it could be some other control signals, such as maybe an amplitude of a gesture or speed, or maybe being angry, etc. Based on this control, we want to generate a sequence of gestures, as shown on the right. So the field of gesture generation has fairly long history of, I think, more than 3 decades by now. And lately, when it shifted to machine learning based approaches, there has been a lot of problems with benchmarking. There is no good objective metric to measure objectively how good is a given gesture. Not everybody is doing their subjective evaluations. Those who do don't always compare with other systems, and those who compare with other systems don't always do it in the same and coherent way. So because of all of that, it's been really hard to understand what is the state of the art and if a given paper is introducing something better than the other one. And so to address that, we have started this series of gesture generation challenges. It has started back in 2020 and was followed by a second challenge last year, 2022. And this year we have a 3rd edition. This year challenge has been expanded from a single person gesture generation to a dyadic setting, where we have 2 people in interaction, and we want to generate gestures for a main agent, here shown on the right, while taking interlocutor on the left into account. So in this setting, what's given to the participants is speech of the main agent, but also speech and gesture of the interlocutor. And the task is to generate gestures which don't only align with your own speech, but also with the interlocutor. And we will see how far the field has advanced in that so far. So the challenge pipeline is basically the same every time we run the challenge. The challenge participants receive one and only dataset, including train, validation, and test split. They use the same visualization that's provided to them at the beginning of the challenge, and they're at the end evaluated in a joint way in the same evaluation structure. So now, in this case, the only thing that differs are the systems themselves, and that allows for direct comparison and proper benchmarking of those systems. Dataset that we use this year is called Talking with Hands dataset. It's been recorded and released by Facebook or Meta. It has around 20 hours of audio and corresponding 3D motion capture. And on top of that, we have also transcribed this audio to obtain text transcriptions. Here on the right, you can see an example from an interaction. They basically recruited people and had them have a small talk in the motion capture studio. There was no particular script or restriction on top of the topic, so they could talk about anything they wanted. And the gestures was conversational, unlike most of the previous data sets you might have seen where it was a presentation setup. Here, the setup is conversation. And as the data set itself is dyadic, it nicely lends itself in a task of dyadic gesture generation.
And that's new this year, right?
Yeah. Here is a visualization that was provided to all the challenge participants. It has 2 modes. Either they could visualize only the main agent that they generate, if they want to focus on that, or they could generalize the full conversation, where you will see sort of the frontal view of the interlocutor on the left, main agent on the right, and on the bottom, you will see a side view on the both of them. This year, we had 36 registrations, meaning 36 teams. Each team would have an average around 3 people. I show a map and color code for where those teams were. You can see it's quite diverse. I think the largest number of teams was in China, closely followed by Korea and US. But we can clearly see that this has become an international effort and a sort of kind of a worldwide challenge, which is great to see. And I hope someday we will have more representation of the Global South. Out of those 36 registrations, we had 12 teams which went all the way till the end and submitted their system for the evaluation. So here are the conditions that we evaluated. We had natural motion. This was a motion capture from the data set. We had 2 baselines, BM being a monadic baseline from the last year's challenge, which won the reproducibility award and had a pretty good quality code on GitHub. And BD is a dyadic adaptation of the same baseline, which now takes interlocutor into account. So the model on the background is the same, but now interlocutor is also considered. And both were kindly provided by the authors of the baseline, Jerry Chang. And we had 12 submissions SA to SL, which has been anonymized and will only be shown by their code. So we evaluated 3 dimensions of gesture generation this year: human likeness, appropriateness to speech, and appropriateness to interlocutor. And I will go into the evaluation of each of them one at a time. Before I do that, I would like to show you an example, and I will ask you which of the 2 was synthesized.
I was cracking up at that whole scene. He was like cracking me. I like him a lot. He's one of my favorite characters. But yeah, that was really good.
Can we watch it again or not?
I was cracking up at that whole scene. He was like cracking me. I like him a lot. He's one of my favorite characters. But yeah, that was really good.
So which one you think was synthesized? Left or right? Well, in fact, it was both. And I will get to that in a bit. So let's talk about human likeness. The evaluation we used was the same evaluation interface that we developed for the very first challenge. We call it HemVip. It's an adaptation of a web mushra that was typically used in speech synthesis. In this interface, participants could play 1 video at a time, and for which videos they play, they could give it a rating on a sliding scale. You will see here on the left, they will have 5 anchors: bad, poor, fair, good, and excellent. And there will be a gradient to indicate them that what they're giving us is a gradient. But note that this time there is no number that they put on it. They just put a sliding scale. There is a number on the back end that we are using between 0 and 100, but for participants, this was just a sliding scale. And this way we obtain both absolute and relative scores. Importantly, for human likeness, audio was removed to remove the influence of appropriateness to speech and to disentangle the 2 dimensions. So they would watch silent videos to focus just on the quality of the movement. The study was done in crowdsourced way on prolific academic, having 200 participants and those 15 systems evaluated. What you can see here is the results. Box plots are fairly wide because this is a subjective question. But if you look into the mean with 95% confidence interval in yellow, or median with this confidence interval in red, they are fairly narrow, and we can see a lot of statistically significant differences here. What we can note is that ground truth or natural motion was performed on the top, but still very far from 100, 70. And this is kind of the top line as far as we can go with this data. And there were 2 challenge submissions, SG and SF, which came fairly close to the ground truth. And I would also like to note that there is a fairly broad range of scores here, so we cannot say that naturalness is a solved problem. It is still a challenge, and some teams manage it better than others. Questions so far? Yeah.
One question. This is with the metadata. It is general. So I don't know. The people who were recorded, they know that they're just gestures were the focus of the recording?
Right. So the question is if in the dataset recording, people knew that the focus was gestures. I'm not 100% sure myself. I was not recording the dataset. I believe they were not aware and they were just having a conversation. But that I would have to double check the paper about talking with hands dataset. Yeah.
They were definitely aware that we're wearing mocap suits.
Right. They knew their movements were recorded. That's as much as we know. So if it can be called fully ecological is a question. All right. With that, we're going to move to the second dimension evaluated, appropriateness for agent speech. Here we use the different interface, again, to disentangle from human likeness. In that interface, we would play two videos, both generated every time by the same system, but one of them was generated for this audio and another was generated for some other audio. So basically, we are comparing each system with its own mismatched version. And we do that because both of the videos were generated for the same system, meaning they have the same human likeness. And that's why human likeness shouldn't influence the result. But one of them was generated specifically for the audio that they hear, while the other was generated for some other audio. So the logic is if the gesture is appropriate, in fact, for this audio, they would be able to have a preference towards it. While it's not, then it's going to be like a random chance. So it would either have no preference or randomly choosing one or the other.
We should point out that compared to last year, there are now 5 alternatives. You can indicate the strength of preference.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you, Gustav. But for the interest of time, I'm going to omit some details. This was done on Prolific as well. We had twice more participants because now they would have to watch 2 videos to give us 1 rating. And we had 15 systems. Here's the results. In blue, you can see clear preference for matched, light blue, slight preference for match, no preference, slight preference for mismatch, and clear preference for mismatch. On the most left is a natural, still best. Interesting to note that it was not always preferred, which was first a surprise to us, but then it makes sense if you think about it. Not every time that we gesture is particularly appropriate for speech. Sometimes we might not gesture at all, or sometimes the gesture has nothing to do with the speech. And as Rachel was mentioning before, we are very good in filling the gaps, and we are good in giving meaning to things that we see. So that's why some clearly preferred the mismatch version, because they could assign it certain meaning. So the top line, again, is around 70% here. What you can see is that most of the systems are fairly far from the top line, and like between 50 and 60% preference. So this is still very far from being solved problem, but we can see the program is being made because in last year's challenge, only half of the systems were above the chance, statistically significant. This year, almost every system were statistically significant above chance. So a lot of work to be done here, but still some progress being made. Any questions to that? Cool. Bit short in time. I'm going to go into the third dimension, which is the most tricky one for us to do and probably for me to explain as well. So here we had a special evaluation setup. So basically we wanted to mismatch the interlocutor. So now what we did is we send the challenge participant stimuli, which would have the correct agent speech, but mismatch behaviors interlocutor. Both speech and gesture would be taken from another conversation. And that for that input, they had to generate their gesture. And we specifically selected the matched and mismatched segments in such a way that for the subset that we will use for evaluation, the speaking state is the same. And in fact, in this, we were focusing on the listening. So in both cases, the main agent would be listening. They will be always generating listening behavior, but in one case for this conversation, and another case for some other conversation. And then when we play the video to the participants, then everything is matched, but the gestures themselves would be mismatched only. So the conversation would be sort of the same on both sides, and the interlocutor behavior would be correct on both sides, but now the gestures that the agent made, one would be made for that conversation, and the other would have gesture made for another conversation. Yeah. If you're confused, I'm sorry about that. We were confused as well. It took us like 1 day to figure it out. We explain it in great details in the paper, and happy to chat in the breaks. But this is what we've done. And at the end, we had this pairwise comparison. One had the main agent gesture matched interlocutor, another had main agent gesture mismatched interlocutor. And again, they would have to indicate their preference between the two. Again, it was crowdsourced for 120 participants. Here's the result. And again, around 70% for ground truth. And you can see most of the systems, they're basically lying around chance. Some might be slightly above or slightly below, but even if the difference here is statistically significant, we cannot say it's meaningful. So this is extremely far from being a solved problem.
Just one really important remark here
Yes.
is that we're not able to do this mismatching for the natural speech.
Yeah.
So this is actually, the natural one looks especially much better. It's not, you know, the reason that one is so different is that it's also mismatched to the speech and not only to the interlocutor.
Yeah, good point. For example, for a natural motion, we would just take movement from another conversation. So it was mismatched in many ways, not just with respect to interlocutor. Good point. So what have we learned? We've seen that quite a high score for naturalness and human likeness can be obtained also with diffusion models. Last year, we had one system on pair with natural movement based on motion matching, which showed us that the state of the art at that time was not end-to-end. Now we see that the same quality can be also reached with diffusion models. Appropriateness to either interlocutor or to the speech is still fairly above chance. And if you are beginning your PhD and thinking what to focus on, I would say this is the topic to focus on. Interlocutor behavior has some small measurable effect, but it's still tricky to do and maybe even more tricky to measure. And we believe challenges like this are helpful for us to move the field forward. And I forgot to add a slide for that, but all the materials are publicly available. So all the stimuli used in evaluation are online. The code which used for evaluation and for visualization is online. And even the user study results, everything is online. User study results are going to be online person. So we hope you can use it for your own benchmarking. Any further questions?